and this week we're going to continue learning a bit more about shading in Arnold. We're going to shade one of the assets that we've previously created and learn a couple more new tricks. And then we're going to start preparing the environment and learning how to use Arnold instancing and start creating one of the various layouts. We're going to create a couple small layouts and then hopefully be able to create all of this and learn how to use all the tools and go through the process of updating one of the assets, including LookDev, and doing local overrides as well. So we're going to explore all of that and then hopefully do some more lighting as well. Thank you guys for watching, and let's get started. Thanks. We're going to prepare the data and the scene file to start shading this asset here. And I'm going to add two more attributes to the geometry that we're going to utilize in the shader to add extra variation between the blocks and hopefully do some interesting shading variations. And what I've done is I've created an ID attribute that is a unique number per block, and we've learned how to do this in week 5. And then that got transferred to the geometry. So the high-res mesh has that ID information. I'm going to generate a random color based on that to show you guys. So here we have the visualization, a random color generated from that ID. Okay, and then it's a float attribute even though it's an int. So we'll keep that in mind. And then I've created a rest attribute which basically stores the current position of the points into a rest attribute. And the main advantage of this, if we want to do, let's say we want to make the bottom darker, we can use the height, the Y position of these points and use that to drive the shading. And then when we transfer this, when we translate it, scale it, or change anything, that information is going to stick to the mesh. And if we use anything else relative to the position of the point of the mesh in the render, then the shading is going to change when we reposition it or instance it. So this way it's going to be static and stick to the mesh. And then I've exported that as a V3. So here as a V3, and it's using the base variant, so everything is correct. I'm going to create an Arnold procedural, and I'm going to type in Big Cliff for the name of the asset and version 3. And now we have the mesh ready. I've also created a low-res preview using a poly reduce, and this is what we're viewing in the procedural as well. So now here I'm going to name this Big Cliff Render Procedural, and let's give it a different color. I'm going to assign the shader, which is basically an empty standard shader, and then I'm going to import the light rig from the previous week, which we've changed a bit. So we're gonna keep using that to shade all the assets and use it as the default. So here I have the sky from previous week and the sun. Let's take a look through the camera and let's visualize this. Cool. And let's go to the out context, and I'm going to make sure that the IPR base has everything set correctly. So that, and then the sun and sky. And let's create a render view and select the APR base and hit render, and we should see our assets rendering with the diffuse shader. Cool. Okay, so everything seems to be fine, and we're going to start creating the shader now. So let's start shading this this wall here, and I have two textures that I'm going to be using. This is the first one, and this is the second one. I've created this in week 2, and they're both tileable, and it's a 6K image, and this is the bump map and the specular map. I'm going to be using this for both the specular and the bump. And this is my diffuse, and you can see I'm looking at it in a linear color space, not in sRGB, and that's what we need to view it at, because this is what's gonna go into the render. and then the light will be applied and everything should look correct. And the thing I wanted to talk about is we don't know how these textures will really look like until we try them on the geometry. And the truth is, this texture has gone through a little bit of iteration, and I was testing it with the asset here, but I'm not going to show this process because I want to focus on doing the shading primarily. But what I want you guys is when you do, when we finish the workshop and then you start creating the textures, always have a simple light rig with the simple geometry that represents somewhat what you're going to be creating. Let's say if you're shading a rock, if you're creating the texture for a rock, it's best to have something that resembles to a rock because it's very important for the visual as well to sell that texture. And I've iterated over this, I think 1 or 2 times, just changing the size of these white dots to look as good as possible in this mesh here. But I'm telling you that this is what I've done, but we're not gonna do that here. We're gonna just use them. And I want you guys to implement this workflow when you start doing your own shading and or creating the textures. You have to keep in mind that you may have to go, or probably you will have to go and tweak the textures to give you what you want in the render. So that's something to keep in mind. And let's get started. I'm gonna dive inside and I'm gonna create an image, a color correction. Some of this is a duplicate from what we've done, but I want to go over the process again, probably a little bit faster than before. I'm gonna add a triplanar, and let's connect these guys. I know that I need a color correct because the texture will need to be exposed 2 stops for this case. Okay, and let's connect the let's add the texture. Cool, and I'm gonna expose the texture so we can see it. It's too dark, and again with the light and everything we have to always tweak these things a little bit in the shader. Cool, so let's tweak the repetition here. Why is the scale locked? I don't understand this. Okay, and I'm gonna rotate the map a little bit to move the details to a different area and get something a bit more interesting. So you can rotate the triplanar and to anything you want. And this is just placing the texture in a different, just rotating the texture coordinate. And I wanted to talk about the white that we're seeing right now. And if we go back to this info here, to the image here, we're looking at it through in a linear color space. And let's gain it up 2 stops. Let's expose it. You can see now we're seeing white, but it's not actually white. It's let me try and explain it. So for example here, the color itself is not white, but because it's super bright, we're seeing it as white. But the real value is this for the texture. It's somewhat the value, and this as well. It's what the texture shows us is the real value. And to get white, you don't necessarily have to have super white and bright spots in the texture. This is how I would do it. This is the workflow. I would create the texture and forget about the white and actually try to avoid having pure white values because they're really hard to work with. And having these tones, we can actually get the white that we need easily, and this will look much more realistic. And we'll also have a lot more tones in in these spots versus having just a flat uniform white here. And you can see already we're getting a lot of interesting tones, and this is all because of the LUT as well. So you can see here we're getting some interesting white values, and in other areas it behaves differently, and this is very, very natural. We're also getting a lot of cool informations in the dark areas, and this is very realistic, and it's really hard to squeeze this much information from a texture like this. If you plug this into most of any render without a LUT, you will basically get a garbage, something like this. This is what it would look like in an sRGB space. You can see it's not really interesting at all, and we're not capturing a lot of details from the mesh, from the texture itself. So let's turn on the color IO back, and you can see there is a little bit of artifacts in some of the areas here, and the reason for that is because the triplanar uses the normals to create the UV projection, and in some case the normal transition is very sharp on some of the complex meshes like these guys, and there is a blend feature that we can use to help smooth the transition, and that will fix pretty much everything and make it a lot nicer. I'll set it to 0.5. You can see now we have perfect texture applied to the geometry, and let's continue. So the next thing I want to vary the shading between the blocks. So I'm going to create a user data node, and this is how you read information stored in the mesh as a point attribute. You can read float, RGBA, you can read a string, you can read int, you can read a float, and the ID is stored as a float, so I'm going to use that, and let's type in ID, and I'm going to use a random node, which is very useful, and here I'm going to connect the float, and let's take a look at the result. Okay, now this guy has two inputs. We have to tell it that it needs to use the float value, but we're getting this interesting change here, and the reason for that is because the data is actually one. It's a float. It's an int value, and because of this, we're introducing some errors in the values, and the way to fix that is using a float to int. Boom, and done. And now it's it's 100% cleaner. And I'm actually gonna use the int input and change this to integer, and now we have our perfectly clean variation that we need to use. And now we have this information. We can use, for example, the red channel, we can use the green channel, or any of them to drive the shading, to vary the shading. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another triplanar. I'm going to copy this, and let's preview this texture with the shader. I'm going to type in 0.09, and let's rotate it a bit, and maybe let's increase it, make it bigger, make bigger tiles. Okay, cool. And I want to introduce a little bit of variation, so I'm going to create a color correct node and maybe desaturate this a bit and introduce let's try. I'm just going to try to introduce a touch of blue here, because these rocks generally have a very desaturated color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a mix, and let's mix between this and this new one using one of these guys. Let's try the R channel, and let's connect that. And now it's mixing between using this information. You can see, let's try. I'm using a switch node that I will explain in a second. So this switch node has different inputs, basically from 0 to 20, from 0 to 19, and then based on this integer, it will pick an input. So you can have 5 different colors and have a random number that goes from 0 to 10, and then plug in different 10 colors that will get used to vary the shading. Now I'm gonna do a snap. I'm gonna change the input to 1, and let's compare. And you can see now we're getting more mixing in the shader. Sorry, I mean here is mixed more. Cool. So let's use this. And the information right now goes from 0 to 1, and I want to multiply those values. So I'm going to add a multiplication here, and the reason for that is because the mix goes from 0 to 1, and I've seen that the values doesn't go from 0 to 1. So I want to just add a multiplier and see if I can make it make the difference a bit more clear. And make it more pronounced. That's the word. And let me do something super quick to make sure to show you guys that it's working. So I'm gonna create another color correct, and yeah, so it's already very obvious now. And let's set this back to 1. Pardon me. Cool. So you can see we're getting a lot of interesting variation. It's probably too much here. So let me delete this. And let's tweak this guy a bit more. And we can keep doing this. Let's add another mix between this guy and another version. So let's copy this. Let's copy the triplanar as well. And unfortunately, we don't have the mix only accepts 2, so the network may get a little bit complicated. So let's move this. And I'm gonna make the details smaller. And let's just rotate it so it's not the same at all. And let's pick a different channel now. Instead of the red, let's pick the green. Let's make sure it's also multiplied. And in the color correction, I want to change it now. I'm going to use a complementary color. Let me check the texture by itself. Actually, I wanted to make the details smaller, so let me increase this. Okay, and let's take a look. And let's make this red to see it completely. Okay, let's set this back to 1 as well. And now, see, I'm not liking this. The percentage of how much we're getting this new texture is a lot. And what I want to do is I want to generate something else. So I connected this. This is my random value. Actually, let's, yeah, that's fine. So this is my random value. And what I want to do is I'm going to generate another random value from these guys. So I'm going to connect it here. And let's use the int instead. And make sure we convert the float to an int. And now we should get something with less variation, exactly. But this is... try this. So this mask, I'm going to use that information and multiply it with this. And now basically we're mixing the two masks. Cool. So now we're getting more variation, and I'm going to use more variation that only isolates a few blocks. I'm going to use that in the new mix, which is already connected. So let's see. Nice. So we have less blocks with that new texture, and we can also use a ramp to remove any small values. Let's say I want to remove values from this range and only keep it in that range, or we can add another dot here and just pick. Come on. So we can specify using a ramp which blocks we pick based on their values. Okay, so let's tweak this to add more variation. Okay, cool. And the last thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit more variation to all of this. So what I'm going to do is I am going to take this texture and see how I'm not liking all these details here. I want to break those up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let me check something. Yes. So see here with these triplanar, actually maybe it's best to explain this in a different section. Okay, so now we have this this information, and it's using the point position, and I don't want to use that. I don't want it to use the current position of the points. I'm going to create a user data RGB to import the vector, and I'm going to import the rest attribute, and let me show you guys the rest values. So this is the position of the points. I'm going to use that in the position of the triplanar. So let's convert RGB to vector. Yeah, I'm not so sure. Okay, let's not try to change the position completely. I'm going to do something else. See this offset here? I'm going to use that to vary the shading per point. So I'm going to create a noise attribute, and I'm going to it's a vector. I'm going to create a vector noise. Let's set it to world, something like that, and then I'm going to use this in the offset. And let's take a look. See, now we're getting this very interesting breakups within the texture using the triplanar node. And then what I can do is I can change the noise. That's probably too much. It's too much. Let's take a look at the noise size. Yeah. So let's say 2 and 2, and let's add 4 octaves. A little bit of distortion. Cool. So now we have distorted the texture just using the triplanar, but I don't want to generate the noise that that is based on the world position, because it will change as the mesh changes, which could be fine, which should not cause a problem. It could actually generate more interesting variation between the blocks. But I want to show you guys how you can use the rest position, which will look exactly the same, but when we transfer the mesh, it will stick to the mesh. So we'll use that for now, and then we're gonna copy these guys, and let me plug them in here. I want to change this pattern for the offset, and I'm going to copy it, and I want to change the original as well. And I'm gonna add a little bit of offset and maybe change this to have bigger scales. And let's take a look at what we have. Cool. So now we have more variations. We're not going to be able to fix this completely. We have to distort that information in the mesh, unfortunately, and it's a little bit tricky. We need to do that in SOPs. But we've broken up the texture a lot. You can see now we have a lot more interesting details that we've added. We have a lot of cool variations. Let me render this at a high resolution, and I'm not gonna pause. I want to show you guys this, and we have one diffuse bounce, remember, and there is no bump, nothing at the moment, and that's our texture. And we're gonna add a little bit of specular to it, a little bit of bump, and hopefully call this done and continue, start building the layout. So let's continue and add the bump and specular, and I have imported the texture here, which we're gonna use for both bump and specular. I'm gonna create a color correct node, and I'm gonna create a triplanar. Now, obviously, in theory, we would have to match what we've done here exactly if we want the bump to follow the surface, but I'm not going to worry too much. We can simply desaturate this image and use that to add a little bit of bump and have everything else come from this texture here. So we can mix both of them. And I'm gonna we'll play with this when we start seeing the result of the bump. And I'm gonna add a bump node, and let's connect this to actually here. Normal. I'm still used to the old thing. And now let me lower the resolution a bit, and the settings as well. I'm gonna turn off GI so it's faster to work with. And let's turn off specular indirect as well. And you can see now the bump is destroying the normals a lot. So let's reduce this. I think we can go a little bit higher. Oh, actually, we don't know how the triplanar looks like. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so it's very tight. Let's set this 0.06, something like that, and let's add the blend. Okay, not so sure why we're getting. Sorry, 0.06. Okay, cool. Let's take a look. And let's increase the bump here. It's probably going to be too high. And what I think it's working nicely now. What I generally like to do, the diffuse is really tricky to see the bump with. I always prefer to look at the specular component. So I'm going to increase the spec and set it to 0.15. I'm going to add the specular AUV and just take a look at that. So we have it. Okay. And for this, we have to make sure that we have enough sampling. So I'm gonna increase the settings. I'm gonna focus on this section here. Okay, so I think it's too much because we're getting a lot of distortion. We're getting the spec is very uneven, and I'm gonna go back to 0. See what we're getting first. Okay, let's gain it up, so there, and let's try 0.025, and let's focus on this section here. Okay, we can add more, 4 times that. Let's try even more. Yeah, it's too much here. Yeah, I think this is good now. So let's take a look at the full image. And let's increase it a little bit. Okay, so we have our specular, and I'm going to use this information as well to in the specular, but I want to squeeze a little bit more information from the bump. So I'm going to add a little bit more gamma to it to have more contrast in the image, and I'm going to gain it up a little bit, which will also affect the bump values. Yeah, I think it's cool. So we'll leave it at that. And then I'm going to use the same information here for the specular. So I'm going to put down a range attribute, and I'll explain why I'm doing this. And let me move these guys closer to the node. I'm going to add a dot, and I need 2 of these. So I want to vary the specular between 0 and 5 to 0.5 and 0.9. And then the roughness, I want to change it between 0.2 and 0.6. So in the, 0.6 and 0.2. So in the darker areas it will be rougher, and then in the brighter areas it will be less blurry. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think it's working. Now, what else do I like to do? I want to use that rest information to add a little bit more shading variation. So what I'm going to do is I copied that rest attribute, and let me create a color correct node. And here within the color correct, you can see we can drive all these values using any input we want. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to connect this, and I'll show you why. So we can change it along the height. So let's actually do that. And let's fit range this. -6, -10, and 10. Okay, and let's put down a ramp. And I want to invert that, so I want just the bottom part. This is something we've done, but I think it's cool, so we'll repeat it again. Okay, and I'm going to use that information to actually change the exposure in here, or any values, but we'll use the exposure. So let's add a exposure, and let's take a look. Actually, it's exposing it, it's the other way, so we'll add, we can add a multiply. we need to invert the ramp. So let me remove this. It's too much. Yeah, and let's put down a range. I don't want it to affect this much. So I want it to fit that between 0.1 and, and 0.8. Okay, I'm not seeing, pardon me, I'm not seeing the impact on this clearly, but we'll leave it at that. I don't want to spend too much time on that. I think you guys know how to do this. And I'm lowering the settings so it's a little bit faster to work with. The interactivity is a little bit slow. I'm not so sure what's happening. Let me kill this this render and hit again. Hit the render button again. Pardon me. Okay, cool. So what I want to do is with this shading information before I deviate it, I'm gonna take the X. Is it the X? Let's take a look at the X value. Yes, I want to take the X value and see how we're getting some kind of cool depth map for this image. And this is really cool. I want to use this information to drive, vary the shading a little bit more on the geometry itself. And I'm gonna, we gained it down. So let's put down a range node. Actually, these values are good. No, they're high. So let's range from 0 to 3 to 0 to 1, 4, 3.2. I want this guy to be white, so I'm looking at that. Okay, that's cool. And then I'm going to use this as a multiplier. So I'm simply going to multiply this whole thing with this texture. And let's just use a single value. And let's plug this texture here and take a look. See how we're getting that the shading added onto the mesh, but it's affecting the texture a lot. So I'm not going to use this to multiply the texture. I'm going to use it in the base to vary the diffuse intensity, and I'm going to use the original texture. And I think the range thing is, the height variation is not working well. Pardon me. I think the height variation is not working as expected. So I removed it, and I'm gonna focus on getting this to work. And I want to vary the shading to be between 0.7 and 1. So it's darker here and brighter at the upper level. I can increase this actually, 1.4. And we're getting a lot of more depth into this. It's like a fake occlusion, basically. Okay, I think it's too much, but it's fine. You guys get the idea. And I want to do one more thing with this. I like to have these guys have more specular on them. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna copy this guy, the noise here. I want to generate a noise map. And it's not a vector. I don't want a vector. I want a scalar noise. Okay, cool. And I want to multiply that noise with this. So let's set it to 0 and 1. So I want just the top part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down a ramp. Let's do a ramp RGB. And something like that. And right now the position, I want to break these guys. I don't want them to be this uniform. So what I'm going to do is, I know this is getting a little bit complicated. So let's see, I'm going to move this. I'm going to change the noise to a vector. And I'm going to add this noise to this position. Okay, the rest attribute is now, it has a noise added to it. And I'm going to look at what we're interested in. Which one? The red channel. Let's take a look at the red channel, which should represent the depth. You can see now the position is distorted using this vector, and I increase this and it will get more and more distorted. I'm actually going to increase the scale. I want finer details, not that much. So let's try 5. Okay, something like that. So let's set this to 1, and then I'm going to use this. I'm going to use this information here to vary the shading instead of just that uniform. And let me connect this here. And let's take a look at the ramp. Okay, cool. Now see how we're getting that nice edge instead of that uniform edge, and this is going to be much more useful. And let's take a look at the values. 1, that's fine. And all I want to do now is add this to the specular. So here, and this guy. And this is my specular. Okay, now you can see we've changed it, we've added that information into the mesh. Now let me move these guys. I know it's getting a little bit complicated, but it's very straightforward. The process makes a lot of sense. We just isolated some parts and added them back to the specular to have more specular on those areas. I think that's pretty much it. Okay, and we can also pardon me, we can also multiply this to make it more clear. So the red value, to make the specular show up even more on those parts, we can multiply it to anything we want, and that will make it more visible. And you can see it here, there's more distortion. Actually, let's play with the noise to show you the effect. See how much it's broken down now? That's because we added a vector to the rest position to break this up even more. Cool, so let me change it back to, I can't remember the value, and let's set this to 2. Cool. Okay, what else do we need? I'm not going to use this. I think the shading along the height is, you guys have seen this, so I'm not going to spend time on that. And I think the APR crashed. Hopefully it did not, because I didn't save this file. And let me pause and come back. It just came back. I'm not so sure what happened, but I think the machine froze for a couple of seconds because of all what's happening. And you can see, let's take a look at the spec again. You can see we're getting a lot more specs now on these parts, which is very interesting, and we're not getting that much specular in these parts. Cool. So what else? I think that's pretty much it for the shading. I wanted to show one more thing using the ID and the random thing. So I'm gonna copy that and come in here. And what I want to do is let me delete these guys. I'm gonna connect this random guy, and we should see a black and white map. Sorry, not black and white, but yeah. And I'm gonna tick on grayscale to generate a black and white, so the values goes from 0 to 1. And I'm gonna add a compare node, and with this compare I'm gonna tell it if the value is less than 0.5, show me the result. I'm gonna use this input, and let me verify something. Okay, and then it's returning a boolean right now, and the boolean goes from 0 to 1. And I'm gonna use that with a switch RGBA. I'm gonna set this to 1, and I'm gonna connect this to the index, and let's take a look. And boom, now we have 50%. We're isolating 50% of the rocks only. I can say I want 10%. Sorry, it's the other way. Let me change this to greater than. So now we're isolating 10%. Now, unfortunately, there's not so much that we can do about that attribute, but I think this will work just fine. And let's say I want 0.2, for example. And what you can do is you can change the seed to get different blocks, and you can treat them differently. So let me do this. I'm gonna copy this guy, and I'm gonna collapse it so it doesn't take a lot of space. And I want to do something. I wanna view the shader. I'm gonna change view properties. And I'm gonna turn off diffuse and add more specular. I want more reflection, and I'm going to actually turn off, disconnect the diffuse component, and I want to lower. I don't want this much diffuse. I want to make it. I want to make the specular more visible. So I lowered the diffuse, and we have the same specular, and then I added a second one, which is 0.1. I'm gonna give it a different color as well, just a tiny bit of tint in there. And I'm gonna lower the roughness. I want it to be super clean, and I'm gonna turn off normals. I'm gonna disconnect the bump. Okay, and that will make it look much cleaner without the bump. And what I'm going to do is I'm gonna use a node called Mix Shader. And this is something new in Arnold 5. You can mix BRDFs. And I'm gonna mix these two guys. And let's take a look. And now this is not a shader multiplication. This is not, it's not combining the result. It's combining the BRDFs, and then that goes to the render. So it gives us back a physically plausible result. And what I want to do is I want to use that the map that we've created as the blend between the both of them. So I'm putting the mix in, and let me change this to let's have something unique so I know this is the shader. Let's add emission. So let's add a red emission. Boom. That's where we're getting the new shader, and I'm actually going to change it to let's leave it at blend. Cool. And now we're adding this BRDF into the mix to add this new look back. And what I'm going to do is I'm gonna actually turn off the diffuse completely, and I'll explain why I'm doing that in a second. Let me turn off the diffuse, the emission as well. And you can see now we're getting this shader more visible in here. Let's put back some of that diffuse in. And what I wanted to do is I want to simulate the look of having a secondary specular on top of this that doesn't have a bump. You can see these guys don't have bump on them. And with this, we can simulate having a wet layer. Like, let's say this is it's raining, for example. You still get the bump and everything, but you will have a clean coat on top of everything that is much smoother than the actual surface itself. And I'm going to copy this, and I'm not going to use the switch. I want to use the add mode. So I want to add that. And I'm going to add this specular component onto the mesh, and I'm going to turn off the diffuse. And let's turn off the specular as well. I just want the clear coat. Don't care about that roughness. And the reason I turned off that is because I want to use this this section here, which can have its own normal. So see, this guy can have its own normal. We can also use the this normal to affect everything, but you guys get the idea of, I think you can mix multiple BRDFs with different normals to get interesting shading. You can see now we're getting these smooth crack lines on top of everything, and that simulates having basically the rain on top of a surface. And let me snap this. Sorry, let me snap. Where's the button? This guy. And I want to rotate it 45 degree to capture, to have the surface face more this direction. You can see how we're getting those nice highlights, and that's coming from the secondary layer on top of it. And if we render this, you know what? Let's do this. Let's multiply this by 10. Okay, cool. And let's multiply it by 6. And let's go back to the IPR base. I'm gonna make a copy just in case, and let's hit render here. Sorry, I'm gonna use the mplay. So sometimes I noticed that the cool thing with mplay is you can append images and compare them, but most of the interactivity passes I use the render view. And see now, even with the ACES workflow it's set on, it's not loading the LUT. And what I generally have to do is I need to load in the LUT by hand. I'm gonna do that. So I'm gonna right click, load LUT, this guy, and set the color, the gamma correction to 1. Now the other thing I notice is mplay is a little bit, well, it's darker overall than the render view. See here it's crushing the values a lot, and yeah, this is much more accurate. I'm not so sure why this is happening. And right now we're rendering with a very low res settings, so we're not capturing all the details, but hopefully you guys get the idea. So I'll let this render for a couple more frames and we'll take a look at it. So in this video we're going to start gathering our assets and preparing everything for layout. And before we do that, I wanted to show the render, and this is what we have. And it's a little bit fast, so it's hard to see, but you can see there's this top layer on top of everything plus the shading. Let's take a look at the specular. You can see the layering of the shading as well here. You can see the different layers, which is very cool. And this is our diffuse texture, which is diffuse lighting, which is very cool as well. And I think we're done with this asset. And all the other stuff that I showed, all the other stuff in the course is done using very similar technique and using the same textures. And hopefully I'll be able to show some of the scene files so it's not blurry for you guys. And I'm gonna start, let me move this, and let's start a fresh scene. And what I'm going to do is we need to import the assets. And I have a simple script here that I made as a shelf tool, and all you have to do is create a new shelf tool and give it a name test. And then for the script, we're gonna copy these lines here. I'm gonna paste them and hit apply. And if we click test, it will ask you for the name of the show, and the show name is AAC Workshop. I'm gonna type that and hit enter, and it will try and go and locate for all the assets. Now I've made a lot of temp assets that don't have the data set up correctly, and I'm gonna go over and clean those up and delete any unused data. So I'm gonna delete all the temp ones. And let's run it again. Cool. So as long as we have the data in there, it should import everything correctly. And I have a lot of duplicates. I have various things here, and they're not all shaded in this environment. So we'll keep the one that are shaded recently, that we've shaded together, and then the other ones will have to assign a new shader temporarily for them. And actually all the environment that I showed were done using a single shader, the complete full environment, I mean. So let's go over this. Let me hide everything, and let's start viewing them one by one. So this one is valid. Let's keep it. This one is just an example. I'm going to delete it. This one, maybe. I'm not sure. We'll check it in the render. So, and let me give these guys a color. So the one that is valid, we'll give it a green color. The one that needs to be checked in the render, we'll give it a purple color. Same purple. This one, I don't think we're going to use this. So let me give these guys a black color. The one in depth, we're not going to use this. What's the difference? Yeah, I think we're going to use this one because it's the bent version of the cliff, full bent. We're not going to use this. We're going to use just the full bent version. We're not going to use this. These guys will probably use, so we'll give it a green color, and this is a green color as well. Let's hide this. Okay, we're going to use this for sure. I'm not sure if this is the correct asset or not, because I made duplicates for the workshop. This we're going to use. I mean, I don't have a clear idea where I'm gonna put it. Last time I just tried to fit it in. This guy will use. Can't remember if we did export the version that we shaded together or not, but it should not be a problem. We'll find that out soon. And let's see. This one is empty. It doesn't have a preview. So we'll delete it. preview workshop base. I'm not going to use that. This is an asset that we didn't talk about, so I'm going to delete. This is not included. Delete. This is not used. Maybe you can use it. I'm not sure. This one we're going to use for sure. And this one in doubt. So let's put it here. Okay. So we have them all lined up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder and call it XX, let's say 200. In the AAC workshop, I have an XX, which means for a sequence name, and then these are basically the shots. So I'm going to call it XX200 layout. Sorry, layout prep.v1, and I need that light rig. So I'm going to import that just by hand. I'm going to copy paste it here. I'm going to create a camera and go in the out context. Let's delete this. Let's create an Arnold node, and I'm going to include everything that is not these three. Okay, so I'm gonna make a copy of this, and then let's go back to the object context, and I want to force these assets. Except the artistic, the standing blocky cliff base, and the cliff stairs R&D base, and this guy. Okay, this is the geometry, and then the force lights, I want to include these guys. Okay, and let's, I'd like to make a copy of this. I'll explain why in a second. So I have a copy of the viewport. I'm gonna set it to always on top, and let's switch to the render view and check the resolution. I want to reduce it and make it square actually, and let's hit render. So it's rendering. It's gonna take a few seconds for it to load in the millions and millions of points. And let me make sure that the render settings, I'm outputting the logs, detailed logs. I think there is an error with one of the assets. Probably the texture is missing or something. So let me find where I opened Houdini from. And then we can check it. Okay, cool. So this is the thread, and I'm gonna take a look at the logs here, and we'll be able to know if we have an error in the scene or not. And I wanted to show you guys this process because if I wanted to do everything real time. If there is a problem, I want to show you how I'm going to solve it and how I will try to fix it. I may not necessarily fix it and we have to pause, but I want to do everything as live as possible instead of trying to prepare everything so it magically works all of a sudden. And I'm going to display these guys in the viewport. And now the reason I set the resolution to square is because I want to follow, I want to see it in here, and then I can select individual assets and move them. Generally I work on a bigger resolution, but because I'm recording I can't do that. So let me move these guys, and let's turn off this from the viewport. Where is it? Viewport selection. So I can select it. Let's move this. And remember, we're dealing with very high-res assets now. If we zoom in to these guys, They are the real deal. So they're all super high res. And let's move this guy away. I'm not sure why the sun is not, why these guys are not receiving that much light. And let's move this. Okay, I'm gonna scale it, or we'll do that later, it's fine. But you can see we can tumble in and look at all the high-res assets. Now it looks like none of them have the shaders attached to it, and I'm gonna go back and verify and make sure that I'm including at least the two assets that I've shaded them. So I'll do that. I'll pause and do that. And this is pretty much all the assets that we sorry, not all of them. Yeah, this is all the assets that we're going to be using, and we're going to start creating the environment using them. Now there is one that I'm not seeing a preview for, which is this guy here, and I'm not sure where that is. Yeah, it doesn't have a preview, and that is called Sharp Cliff Based. Sorry, it's hidden. Yeah, it has a preview. Okay, so we have all the assets that we need. This is how we're going. This is what we're going to be using to build the environment, and I'm going to start by creating the ground using this element, and then we'll have a base that we will add the remaining assets for. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm gonna pause and then find a look for this. It's the same version that we've shaded together, so I'm gonna find that and import it. And then the other thing is I'm gonna find the version that we've created together that has the shading information embedded in it. So we'll do that in the next video and explain the process and hopefully start building the scene. So now we're going to make sure that we're importing the latest asset of the ones that we've shaded. And this one, I'm rendering it, I'm showing it, but it's actually not in any of these guys. So we need to create a new one, and I'm gonna copy this because it's called Big Cliff Base, and it's the base variant. And I'm gonna include that, only that, in the render settings. So it is there. Let's hit render. Okay, cool. So it's rendering. And what I want to do is I want to bend this 45 degrees so we can use it in a circular environment, and I'm going to override this geometry, and I want to also include the shading. So what happened is after we finished the shading, we need to export the data back again. And so far we've been only using the geometry to do the shading, and we haven't exported anything back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first add the bend deformation to the geometry. So I'm going to use a bend node and a transform to move it to the correct location. Okay, cool. And then let's verify the low res version, and that needs to be updated now. Okay, and I don't want to recompute the poly reduce, so I'm just gonna apply the bend to the low res version as well. And let me hide everything. Okay, so both of them are deformed now. The high res, let me hide this. The high res and the low res. Cool. And we have the shader finished as well. So everything is fine. I'm gonna go to the out context, change this to 4 for version 4, and then hit render, and that should export everything needed. And then I'm gonna go back to the layout scene and import version 4 and make sure that everything is rendering fine. Now we've only shaded two assets again, and I'm gonna just use these two shaded version, and everything else will have a different shader. So let's go to the object context and change this to 4. And we need to hit the render again to cause it to re-export the geometry. Cool, so everything is rendering correctly with the shader attached. Now let's take a look at the other asset which we've done together. So that is called the base cliff. Where is it? The standing cliff base. So I'm going to copy this name and let's include that, and let's take a look in the viewport to make sure that we're seeing it. Okay, it's this guy, and I'm going to go to the original scene. So this is the scene that we've created together, and this is the geometry. Again, we were shading the live procedural, and we need to re-export everything again. Now what I'd like to do is I want to re-export the geometry and turn off the displacement because it was slowing down things. So I'm gonna set this back to the their default values. Let's set it on both of them, and no subdivision. And I think that's pretty much it. I'm gonna re-export again, and that will include the geometry now. And I'm gonna export this, not the procedural. So that will include everything. And let's go back. Let's increase this to version 3. And it's gonna hit that, so cool. And this will include the shader as well. Okay, let's change it to version 3. And let's go to the render view and hit render. And we should see our object rendering correctly. Now, it would be ideal if we had everything set up to have the same scale or relative scale, because some of the values may depend on that, like the bump values and things like that. But hopefully you guys can improve on that and have a unified pipeline where you can have a reference scene scale. You can also have some kind of reference in your scene whenever you build new assets and use that as a reference. So why is this not rendering now? Interesting. Oh yes, sorry. Forgot to, the reason it's black is because we have displacement turned on in the shader, and I forgot to remove that. So I can do it here and go back to the out and export, and that will just override the asset. Now again, I was talking about the scale. You guys can have a human as a reference, and then whenever you build a scene, you drop that guy and use it as the reference for what the scale should be. I'm not going to worry too much about that at this point. Okay, let's hit render again. Cool, so everything seems to be working as expected. Now obviously it's going to be slower because there is GI as well. So let's turn that off. There is reflection, so let's turn those two off. But everything should be the same. The light rig is the same that we used for shading both of them, so everything should be fine. And I think that's pretty much it. I'm gonna check these assets and see what they are. That looks very realistic. Cool. Let me copy the viewport again. And I really like this. I want to tumble and take a look at it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the out context, and I'm going to copy this again. And let's go to the object, and I want to only include these three guys. So drag. Let's have this always on top. We can't have them. Okay, that's fine. Let's drag this. Okay, and let's hit render, pardon me. And let's view this in the viewport and see what we have. Okay, it's these three guys. Okay, so it looks like this guy has a different shader, so and it looks like it's not the same geo, so I don't know which one to keep. I mean, you guys can use both, so we'll keep the blue one and delete this guy, and then this I'm gonna delete. Okay. Yeah, I think we have everything we need now, and we're going to start creating the environment. So now we're going to start creating the layout, and I've hidden everything else. And I'm going to start instancing this geometry here. So I'm going to move it to the side, and let's give it a different color. And the way we do instancing is using the native Houdini instance node, and this is supported in Arnold. I'm going to copy this name, paste it, and add instancing, so I know this is what is used to create the instance of this object, and I will always keep them side by side, so I know I can easily track that. And then all we have to do is drag this in here and change this point instancing to full instancing. And let's hide this. You can see now we have one copy. And the reason we have one copy, if we dive inside this instancing node, there is 1 point. And we can add more points. Let's move this. And let's add this. So now we have 2 copies. But we're not going to use this. We're going to create a circle. I'm going to set it to Z and X. And let's give it 10 units. And I'm going to create a... I'm going to create a scatter and scatter some points, and boom, that's our instancing. And if we dive inside, we just see the points here, and if I go back up, I can pin the viewer to always show me this result, but then when I dive inside, it will still be pinned so I can see the result. And I'm gonna turn off relax points. And the first thing we want to do is we want to randomize the scale. So I'm going to create a random attribute, and basically there's few attributes that are supported by default. Well, the few attributes that are supported, there's not much else that we can do. We can drive the scale, orientation, and add any custom attribute that we want, but to basically modify the shape of the geometry, there's only scale and rotation, and the position is coming from the points, and those are the things that we're going to be changing. So I'm gonna change this to go from let's see, 0.5 to 1.7, and it's a one float. It's a uniform scalar. And then I want to create an angle, and the way we change the rotation is using quaternion. So I'm going to create a point VOP and dive inside and create a quaternion. And then we have to export this as a 4 floats. Bind export. Come on. We need to export this as float 4, so this guy, and then call it orient. And by doing that, we can rotate the instances per object. Okay. and you can see the value here, the angle is not in degrees, so we can change that. We can create a rad to degree, a degree to rad, and connect this, and now we can set the degree to a reasonable number and it will be correct. So 90 degree will give us that. And now all we have to do is generate a random number per point for each of these guys. And I don't want to rotate them along the x-axis. I am only interested in the y-axis, so I'm gonna set that. And then let's create a scale, an attribute, and call it scale, and that will be used for the rotation. Sorry, we're gonna call it angle. So angle, it's a single float, and it goes from minus 360 to 360. And let's import that angle. So bind angle, and now we have rotation. So it looks like, okay, cool. So let's increase the number of points, and let's change something else. I want to add height variation to these guys. So I'm going to create a point VOP, dive inside and generate a noise, and then use that noise to set the Y component. So set component vector, and we want to set the Y position. Okay, cool. So now we have randomization, and I'm gonna add more. That's cool. Okay, so I think we're done here. Let's create a camera, or we have camera, so let's place it, and let's hit render. Cool, so now we have our ground element instanced, and we can always go back and fix the mesh. I'm gonna change the resolution to have an HD format. And sometimes the instancing, sometimes this happened where the instancing doesn't, the APR doesn't know, doesn't have the correct geometry in memory, and you have to hit render to get that again. I'm sure this is being worked on and probably fixed in the later releases of Arnold, of H2A, sorry. Okay, so we have the ground element, and let's continue and add couple more. The next element I want is, and the next element I want to start instancing is this guy. So let me show you. Let me show the element. So this one. And the idea is I want to copy this along this circle and have them point out upward. So I'm gonna move this here. And I'm going to copy this, and let's hide this for now, and let's call this, give it the same name, and let's drag this guy here. Okay, that's probably too much, but you can see the benefits of having the proxy version instead of the high-res version. One second. Cool. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to change the circle instead of being, sorry, I'm going to hide this. Instead of filled, I'm going to change it to NURBS curve, and it's a, yeah, it's fine if, no, we need to change it to open arc, so we just get the edges, and then we can scatter points along those edges. I'm gonna set this to 50 for now, and I'm gonna keep that same variation along the height. Yeah, well, let's reduce this to 30. And then let's keep everything the same and let's take a look. Okay, let's pin this. And let's see why we're getting points. Oh, sorry, it looks like there is a translation, so we need to zero that out. And let's take a look. Cool. And now we can play with the scale. So I'm gonna change this to 1, and I want to visualize the ground as well to see how these guys will fit in. I'm gonna move them down a bit, and I'm gonna scale the circle so they're a little bit inside, and I want to scale them down as well. So something like that. I want to get more rotation, more randomization in terms of rotation. So I'm looking for, yeah, this guy seems to be the only option. We can change the seed. And I want the more variation in terms of scale. Cool. And let's add more points. Okay, let's add more scale as well. And let's move them up a bit. I think they're too low. So something like that. And then we don't care about the one at the center. And I want to delete some points to make a gap. So I'm going to do that. And let's take a look here. Let's unpin this and take a look at the points. And I'm going to put down a delete node. And delete some points just to make an opening in the environment in case we needed some entries or something like that. I'm gonna make 4 of them. Let's extend this. And let's actually extend, let's leave it at that, it's fine. Okay, let's see. Cool, and let's add, I think, more points. Probably too much. Let's pin this and let's set it to 80. Yeah, I think this is cool. And let's include this one in the rendering as well, and let's do some renders. And I'm going to create another scene viewer here, but first let me add this. I'm gonna create a scene viewer, and let's change this to the render view and hit render. And let's look through the camera, pin the camera, and see what we get. Okay, cool. So we're starting to get our environment built and ready. And these rocks are very high res. So if we zoom in, see a lot of details. And what I'd like to do is I want to change the settings a little bit, the lighting settings a little bit. And I'm gonna copy this in case I needed to come back to it. And I'm gonna increase the skylight to 2. And this to 8. I want to double everything. And then in the shader, I want to make it more reflective. It's very reflective. Oh, I know why. So let's go to the render settings. And let's set this to 1 to get indirect reflection. And then the GI to 1 as well. And let's hit render. And again, this is This looks like a real bug now. It was not this much visible in the previous version, but now I think it's happening more often. And I'm gonna go back and change my settings a bit, the light settings a bit. I think it's too bright. I'm gonna set this to 6 and this to 1.6. Cool. Okay, we're getting there, and in the next video we're going to continue adding more elements. So we're going to continue creating more elements using the assets that we've done, and I've done a render 2500, and it took just a couple minutes, maybe less than 3 minutes, to finish this with GI and reflection as well. And you can see we have all kinds of cool details. So let's continue. And the next element is I want to create something using these rocks that is pointing downward in a circular motion as well. So I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna copy this guy. Let's put them side by side. I'm gonna remove this, and this is one. And let's dive inside this guy. I'm gonna pin the viewport, and what I'd like to do, the first thing I'd like to do is I want to change the rotation as well. So that we're gonna leave that, and I want to rotate them to point downward. So let's remove this, and I want to rotate them along the X or Z, it doesn't matter. And let's copy this as well, and we want 180 degree, so they're pointing downward. Cool. And right now we're overriding that orientation with this value, so we need to do everything in the same one, in the same node. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna copy these two nodes, and then add them together. Let's turn this off, and 180 degree, and then on the x-axis. Let's see. Interesting. I'm not so sure why we have to do this. Maybe because we're adding both of them together. Yeah, it could be because of the result. So it's fine. We're not gonna worry too much about that. I'm gonna change the scale of this outer circle, and I'm gonna remove these deletion, and I'm gonna scale them a bit more. Okay, cool. And you know what? I don't think the rotation is working. So I'm gonna copy this, and I'm gonna scale it down like that. And I'm gonna use this instead. So let's drag this in here, and I'm gonna remove the inversion that we've added. Okay, cool. So it's much cleaner now. It's adding the overhead of having this geometry red twice, these two unique, but Arnold is not gonna Arnold is gonna be smart about these two guys, and will know that they are instants, and will only read the mesh once. So it's totally fine to do this. Okay, cool, something like that. And I think maybe too many pieces right now. Set this 0.5, and let's reduce this. Yeah, something like that. Cool. And let's take a look. Let's add this guy to the render. And hit render. Let's go to the scene view. I'm gonna select the camera and change the resolution to match what we have, just for consistency. Okay, cool. And let's take a look. Okay, getting there. I'm gonna move these guys down a bit. And now the instancing is not working. Sometimes it's flaky with this. Okay, we'll do it. We'll do it in the scene. That's fine. And I'm mainly interested in this section here, the new bottom part, which I think is looking really cool. Okay, so the next part is I'm gonna keep using this asset because I think it's very rich visually, and I'm gonna create something like this, but bigger, that covers the entire scene. So I'm gonna scale this, and I'm gonna copy this guy, and I'm gonna dive inside, and let's scale it. Cool, and let's move it up. And I want to create some kind of gap in between these and this. So I want to make this center, and then we have something else surrounding it with a gap in between that we can add bridges or anything that we want. And let's dive inside, and we need to make this bigger to fill in the space. And I just realized there was a value set to 0 in the scale, so we'll go back and fix that. Okay, I think this is cool. And let's go up and move it a bit more. Cool. And let's make sure that the scale on this guy is not negative. It's not. So something like that. Okay, cool. I'm gonna add this guy, and let's hit render. Take a look at the viewer and see what we got. Maybe you can place the camera here. Something like this. I want to add more pieces to this guy, so let's do that. Where is it? It's this guy here. So let's add more points, 160. And we have to hit render again to get that because there is a change in the data. It was not this flaky. Could it be because I have the shader override? No. Yeah, I don't remember it being this this flaky, to be honest, with the instancing. Okay, cool. So we're gonna continue, and actually let's do something. Let's add that high-res awesome pillar that we've made, what's called the standing base cliff. Let's do that, and I'm gonna change its color. We'll leave this rendering, it's fine. I have to scale it a bit to match the scene scale, but this may result in changing the display, the bump values and few of the noise settings, so we may have to go back and fix that, which is totally fine. Totally fine to do. And let's try and find a camera where we can see it nicely. We'll do this. And let's take a look at the render view. And we need to add that to the render settings. Okay. I can't remember which one it is. Yeah, it's not this one for sure. So let's, oh sorry, not the sharp one, the base cliff. Yeah, that one. The next part is going to be adding the circular layout that we've made. And so far we've only shaded two assets, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a shader for everything. I'm going to actually go back to the light rig. I temporarily changed it. I'm going to go back and make sure the settings are the original one that we used to shade this, so it's not too bright. And then we're going to create a shader that we're to use temporarily shader, to use one for the ground and one for everything else, so we can create some interesting reflection and things like that if we wanted to. And then the other asset is going to be the wall, which we're going to be creating very soon. Actually, in the next video we're going to start doing that. Cool. I'm going to change the settings and let me show you. I'm going to change this to 7, change this to multiply the resolution 2 times, and I'm going to hit render and come back once it's done. Now we're going to continue and add more to our environment, but before I do that I want to show the final render, and this is the result that we have. And it took, let's see, it took 16 minutes for this resolution. Obviously I have a 36 cores machine, so if you are using a normal CPU you would be getting around the 30 to 40 minutes, but you don't have to render this resolution as well. I'm rendering 2600 and you definitely don't have to do that. And I wanted to show the memory usage, and right now we're at 3 gigabytes memory, so this is really efficient overall, and we have millions of points. And the main poly count, the unique polys are 10 million that get instanced to 178 million, and that's what we're rendering. And it's very efficient to be able to render that with just this much memory. And the most of the render time was in this because of the complexity that this has. And I'm gonna assign a shader to override everything to work faster on the overall scene. And let's continue. So what I'd like to do next is I'd like to add the circular walls to these sides and fill everything at the outer level. Okay, so let's assign a shader first to override everything. I've made a diffuse shader. This is the default, and I'm gonna assign that here. There is an option to override the shaders, so I'm gonna assign that. I'm gonna lower the settings back to 1280 by 720, and the sampling as well. Okay, and let's go back to the scene. And I like this camera, so I'll keep it. I'll just make a new camera and call this reference 1, just in case I needed that again. And I'm going to take which one? The big cliff full bend. And for this one I'm not going to use instancing. It's much easier to do it by hand than having to try to do what we're going to do using instancing. So I'm going to scale this down it's not a perfect circle, so I'm gonna have to fudge that a little bit. Okay, and let's make a copy. I'm going to create a null, and this allows me to rotate the element based on the using the origin as a pivot. So I'm going to do that, and let's make another copy. And let's make another copy. Obviously it's not a perfect circle, but I think we have to, the best thing is to export this exact circle and go back to the original scene and do that. I mean, bend this so it forms just a portion, an arc, 45-degree angle that we can duplicate. But for the time being, I'm not going to worry too much. I'm going to just do this. And we'll try to smooth out the transitions a bit more. Something like that. And same for this guy. And I'm going to use the star symbol. So I'm going to go back to the obj here. And I'm going to type in the name, and then add a star. And if we click here, it will resolve to select all of them, 1, 2, 3. So we don't have to hand type them. And let's make sure it's in the correct position. So I'm going to go back and move them up. I'm going to copy the Y position for all of them. Okay, and let's move just the first one. Yeah, I think it's they're too big, so I'll scale them down. I'm going to copy this as well. And let's tweak the circle one more time. Yeah, I think this is better. Okay. Not great, but I think it's fine for this example. So let's take a look and see what we've got. I want to render this. Let's select the camera. Let's move outside. Okay, let's hit render again. Again, the instancing sometimes doesn't work as expected. Okay. Cool. Yeah, and now the sun is being blocked completely on all of it. So I'm gonna rotate the light rig to have some light come into the scene. And obviously we're not limited by this light rig. We can start creating new ones as long as we make sure that these assets look as good as possible, and that the lighting and the luminance information is similar to the one we used in the development. I do think there is a lot of duplication here happening, but I'm not gonna worry too much. Okay, so let's rotate the light rig. I'm gonna rotate it, rotate all of it, including the sky as well. Something like that. And let's reduce the angle blurriness. Let me set this to 0. I want to see the HDR by itself. Okay. Let's increase this to 2. And let's set this back to 6. Shadow looks very blurry to me at this angle. I think it should be sharp. Yeah, so we'll reduce the angle to 0. I it's too sharp. 0.5. Okay, that's better. Cool, and let's go back and try to find a camera where we can see everything. Something like that. I'm gonna move the camera. Okay, I think this is good. I'm gonna make a copy of this. By just making a new camera, I can make a copy directly. I mean, it made a new camera that matches this viewport settings. And I think we're good for these guys. What else do we have? We have a couple more elements. I'd like to add the brick, the wall bricks, brick wall, whatever, and the other pillars, the cliffs that we've done. And I'm gonna do that without stopping, without having to do renders. And what else? We need this guy. So let's move him. Move it here. And what I've done previously is I've made a square that this guy sits on top just so that I can use this, but there's no real requirement. I think you guys should spend a little bit more time, be more creative than I am with these assets. And I'd like to change I'm gonna move this to 0, 0 first, and I want to set it at the center and then create a null and use that null to transform the asset. So this is good. We'll leave this there. I'm gonna make a copy. Let's connect the null. It's rotated 90 degree. Yeah, this is what I was looking for. Let's move this back. I'm gonna make another one. Duplicate this. 180 degree. Let's make another one. Actually going to move these guys down. Let's make another copy. And let's make minus 90 degree. Sorry. I'm gonna make another one looking upward. Copy this guy. And let's change it to try 90. Let me reset everything. I got confused. So let's try this. Zero rotation here. Let's make a 90 degree here. Okay. That's good. I just want that to close this opening. And I'm gonna move this guy up. And then what else do we have? Let's pack these guys a bit. Shift L. I'm gonna give them all the same color. And the other thing, change. Yeah. Sometimes you have to change the viewport for it to redraw correctly. And what else do we have? We have, what is this? Yeah, we can use this, but we'll make a different version. Let's keep it there. And I want to use this version. I'm gonna scale it down and just make one of these guys trying to connect the scene with everything else. So we'll make it point this way. Again, I don't have a precise idea of what I want, and hopefully you guys will have some more clever and interesting ideas on how to use these assets. I have another layout that I will show later, and hopefully explain more features about the workflow. And I'm gonna rotate these guys because there's nothing preventing me from moving anything. And maybe we'll make another copy of this pointing on the other direction as well. Actually, let's try 4 of them. Let's create a null. I want to move them, I want to rotate them 90 degrees, so create a cross. Okay, we'll keep it at that. I think these could be bigger, so let's modify that. Something like that. And what else do we have? I believe we have another element that I like to use. Not this one. Not this guy. Yeah, this one. So there's another cliff that I made. I'm going to make a few copies of these guys here, and we'll rotate them to make it more interesting. Make a copy, and I flipped it 180 degrees. And let's make one more. Again, I swear I have no idea what I'm doing. But I think it will create some visual elements that is going to be interesting to light. And I wish we have more time to go over and shade all the elements. Let's grab our camera one and let's move it so we can see everything. Okay, I think now it feels like it's missing something if we don't have another cliff here, so I'm gonna add that. And I think this element is actually very interesting. I like these guys. So let me try something. I'm just taking a risk here. Let's see if it works. I'm gonna copy this guy, and let's call this temp. Let's drag this. Make sure it's at 0, 0. And let's see what we have. Okay, so I want to add some rocks like that using this element, but I don't want it to be there. I want it to be at this upper level. So I'm gonna lock the view, which is locked, and I'm gonna dive inside, And let me actually change this back to 1, so if we wanted to scale, we take care of that inside the attributes. And let's move this up so we can see it. Okay, and let's dive inside, make the circle bigger, and let's increase the size for these guys. I don't need any deletion, and let's just increase. I can scale the whole thing here, and I'm not interested in seeing all of them. I'm only interested in seeing the top part. So let me do this, and then let's scale. Let's move it down. Yeah, something like that. But if we clipped these guys, I think we'll get something really interesting out of this. But I will leave it like that just to see what we can get. And then let me see here. Then I have an ocean, which I think will be interesting, but to have as well. So let me show you guys how to create that. I'm going to create a geometry, call this ocean, and then dive inside. Let's create a grid. Let's make it 250 by 250. It's too much. Let's try 20 by 20. Too small. Something like that. And let's take a look at the wireframe. Let's increase it. Try 500 by 500. These guys are bothering me so much, but we'll fix them later. So let's turn off that pin, and let's create an ocean spectrum and ocean evaluate. And let's tweak this. I'm just trying to get some fine details here, and it doesn't look, yeah, we need more resolution. 10, 5, something like that. Okay, cool. So let's see, now the list is going to be tricky, and I'm going to try something. Go back. I think everything that has starts with anything and then ends with instancing is something that we need to use. And then we have all the other elements. So these guys. And let's try this too. Okay, I think we have it. I think we have the patterns that we need. Let's take a look through the camera, and I think we've added too much geometry. It's getting crowded. Okay, let's hit render. We'll find an angle. Now obviously it has a lot more geometry, and forgot to add the ocean. Oh, and that's fine. These guys are super big, super bulky. They're not working well with the design of the environment. This repetition I'm not super happy with. I need to work on the rotation values. Okay, what else? So I'm gonna scale all of these. Let's find them. So I'm gonna create a new null, and because the scene is at the center, I can use that. Yeah, and I think this is better in terms of scene scale. And let's cancel, hit render again. And again, we have a lot of instancing, and a lot of geometry is being read from disk as well. I think we're missing 2 objects, but I'm not gonna waste time and debug that for now. I'm going to turn off the shading, the shader override here. And I want to see the walls with their original shader. So let's hit render. And the walls doesn't look like they have the shader assigned on them. So I'm gonna debug that and see what the problem is. And I think I know what the problem is. I think the version I'm using here is not the correct one. So let me fix that now. So I have 2 versions. We need to use the base one, and I think V3, V4, yeah, V4, and the base is the latest one that we have. This is an older version that I've made myself. And I will explain what that variant is doing once we get comfortable with this. And let me debug this while we are at it. Oh, I know why, because these guys are supposed to go to this first. Yeah. Okay, cool. So everything seems to be fine. There's a lot of repetition, but I'm not gonna worry too much. We only have a couple of assets, so it's obvious that we're gonna see patterns and repetition. And to be honest, I think this element here is very, very unique, very rich in terms of visual, and it's really hard to pick it up and distinguish that from everything else. Okay, and let's see what we have. Cool, texture is working. And remember, we've done everything using the rest position, so even if we change the scale or the position, all the features should stay the same. There's only the bump mapping, and there is a feature to create the bump and tweak it relative to the object scale, so it's independent from its scene scale. But I'm not so sure how we can make use of that. Maybe next week I'll look into that. Cool, you can see we're getting a lot of details here. Oh, I forgot the look, that second layer turned on these guys, so we're gonna get some kind of wet look on these rocks. And the last thing that we're going to do in the next video is create 2 shaders, one for the ground and one for everything else, just to have some kind of shading on them. And then, yeah, I think that's it. That's it for this week. Cool. I'm gonna change the camera now. Pick a more interesting angle. It's the camera one. And I think the water level is too high, even though we're not using it yet. I'm gonna change the lens on the camera. So let me make a copy of this. Let's go back to the scene view. Yeah, something like this. I'm going to add the ocean and do a high-res render. I want to show the other pillar, the other cliff. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. I'm gonna stop now, change the setting, or actually let's change them together so you guys can see that. I'm going to change this to 6 and then this to 1.5 and 1.5. Let's hit render. So now the render is done, and it took 10 minutes for this to finish. You can see we have the shader working here, and you can see we're getting a different information now. It's because the light rig is a little bit different, and the overall scene has different lighting that will pick up more information from the shader that we didn't see before. And for example, the blue overall is a little bit too much here, and I think we need to kill that reflection completely. And this is working, and then we need something else for the entire environment as well. Some parts of this is working really nicely, like these guys here. I think it's working really well. And based on how much indirect illumination is coming, we may see different results from the shader. Okay, so I made another render to a close-up render showing the rock, and I think everything is looking really nice. And I wanted to talk about something. We've turned on the specular bounces, and we have one reflection bounce of everything reflecting each other. So this rock is trying to reflect everything, including the GI and all of it. And this pass is very expensive, but the visual contribution is not that much. It's not huge, but the overhead is really expensive for this. And if we compare this with the specular direct, I think this has a lot more richness, and it's much more useful for us to see versus the other information. If we take a look at the diffuse direct, everything is cool. And then if we take a look at the diffuse indirect, we see a lot of bounces, we see a lot of light, and this is very important for the visual of the image. We cannot sacrifice this. But for the trade-off, if we look at this information versus the whole image and the render time, the contribution of that pass is very minimal. And once we start adding the texture as well, it's going to be even more minimal, less important. So we can kill that. We don't need the indirect reflection, which is a very expensive feature, but it's not going to contribute too much in this environment. So we're going to turn that off. And yeah, and then I turned on the AUV to show you guys that information. And I think that's pretty much it. I mean, there's not much for the scene. In terms of layout building, this is the original file, and it's very, very similar to what I've done. Just minor tweaks. For example, this is wider. The circle is wider, so we have more space here. Maybe we'll do that. And then the stairs, I duplicated them and rotated it so it creates this, I don't know what shape. And then this part I like as well. You can see there's a gap here. I like the distribution of these guys a bit more in this scene, but overall there's nothing that we don't have. It's just a little bit more tweaking, and it's gonna look very similar to this. And this is an animated camera that I rendered, and the ocean is animating, so it takes time to compute that. So this is an animated camera that I did, showing the full environment. Let's see another one. This is another version. And this is a static camera. And this is another animated version as well. So just some rough camera animation, and that's pretty much it. It's very similar to what we've done, and hopefully we'll get some interesting images out of this. Now, what I wanted to talk about is this guy here. So the wall is picking up different lighting, and it's showing us different information. And the reason we're seeing this blue is because there is a lot more indirect illumination, and that is working. That's basically a light hitting these objects, and it's going to show the texture under a different lighting condition. And that's why we're seeing these new blue details that we didn't see before, because of this new lighting condition. And I want to tweak this. I want to change the shader. And for that, I want to show a feature of the pipeline that I implemented. And currently, if we wanted to do this, we have to go back to the original scene and make the change and then re-export again and increment the version, and that will get the update in. But I want to make the tweak here. I want to make it live. So what I've done is I've isolated this object, this guy, and I made an Arnold node. So it's I only have that. Let me verify. Let's make sure it's that one. Okay, and let's hit render. And we should see the wall rendering. Cool. So everything looks correct. And I realized that we made a mistake in the shader, and I want to fix it as well. See, we've used that depth information to vary the shading, and because it's because we remapped it to be dark at the center and white on the other side, here it's showing up black. So we want to remove that completely, and I want to turn off the specular. But the thing is, this is an Arnold proxy with the shader embedded in it, so we don't have access to that. And if we go under the MISC tab, there's this import shader feature. And if you guys remember from, let's see, from the original file when that got created by the script, there's under this export here, export base, if you go under script, there's a post render script. And this is a Python script that gets kicked in to strip out the shader into a separate HIP file. Okay, and if I browse this, you will see, let's see if I can find it. If I browse to the folder where the data is located, you can see there's big_cliff.v4_shader.hipnc. That's the actual HIP file that only contains the shader, and it gets created when we hit the export button. And then there's this import shader feature. So if I hit this, it's gonna go and import the original shader that was used, and it's gonna automatically assign it to the geometry using this expression. So this expression, it was empty before. If I go here, it's empty, and this is the version we just imported the shader on. So let's hit render, and let's go to the shader. And now we can live change it. So let's prove that. Let's change the emission. Okay, it's working. Cool. So what I'd like to do is I'm gonna turn off the second layer, and I'm gonna turn off the feature where we use the rest option to vary the shading, even though we're not gonna see it. So I'm not gonna I'm not gonna remove it. I'm gonna keep it, and that's basically the change I want to do. And remember now that once we have this local override, it's only in this scene. Okay, once we go back to that original scene, we're not gonna have this change. So we have to remember that we have a local override, and I recommend putting a note saying v4 has a shader override to remove the specular component. And this is only local to the scene. And we have to also copy this path and make sure that all the other instances are using it. Okay? So when I make a new publish of this, I will make sure to reapply the same shader or just duplicate this from the scene back to the original one. And let's hit render. And now we should see less specular. That these guys should go away, I believe. Maybe not. Anyway, this is live working, and we can make any edits we want. Now I think there is a color correction that we did where it added blue to the scene, to the texture, and I think that's very dangerous. So I'm gonna reduce that amount, and let's take a look at the asset from a different angle. Yeah, it's very blue here, and let's make sure the light rig is matching the original one. Yeah, it is. I restored it back, and let's rotate it so we have some sunlight hitting. Okay, and let's reduce that blue in there. Yeah, this guy here. Something like that. Now it's much easier to work with and to look at. And the other thing I want to do is, I think the bump is not that intense, and I want to change that. I want to increase the bump level. And let's make sure that we have some roughness in the diffuse. Let's increase that a bit. Cool. So now we have this, and what I'd like to do is I'm going to copy this by hand, and I'm gonna go to that original scene. I'm gonna go to the shader, delete everything, and paste this new version because I like this one better. I'm gonna name it as V2. And now when we make the change, we can we'll get the same look, and we don't have to override it. And we can remove that shader override and have everything being red from here. Okay, so this is one feature, and I really like this wall. I think it looks really cool. So the other feature that I want to talk about is this variant thing. And if you guys, let me go here. If you guys remember, when we take a look, there's this base feature here, and we can type any value, any name we want. And let's say we decided to make a wet look of this, or a destroyed version of this wall, or let's say I want to fix the curvature, for example, and call it full curved, for example, or circular. We're gonna make a new version of this. It uses the same mesh. It's exported. It's done from a different scene, but they're both in the same asset. They're both considered as the same asset. They use the same shader and everything. So I'm gonna go back here. I'm gonna save this scene as circular, and remember it has the new shader that we just pasted. And let's go back to the object. And what I'd like to do, I'm gonna take the circle from these guys. So let's take, which one? Let's make a circle. It's as simple as that. I want to make a circle to get the size that we need, and then use that as a reference to fix the bend. Set this, okay. Okay, so something like that. So let's copy this, and let's go back to the previous scene, this guy. Okay, and this is our wall, and it's been scaled down to how much? This value. So let's apply the inverse of that. Okay, invert transformation. This is the final scale, and let's tweak this. And what I'm going to do is I'm gonna transform this sphere, this circle, to have the, come on, why is this? Let me change it to open arc. Okay, this is the sphere, and I'm gonna template this guy instead. Let's take a look at the points, and I want one point to be there, and then I want this end here to finish here, so that way it's much more it's cleaner. And let's template this, and let's bend it and see the value that we need. It's the mesh is a little bit heavy, so that's why we're getting this. And I'm gonna make a copy of this, and then I don't have to have that copy in there. And let's template this again. Let's go 85. Cool, I think we're there, and let's see the points again. Yeah, it's still, we can scale it a little bit. Let's try 1.1. Okay, I like this. I think this is going to work much better now, and I'm gonna save the scene, and all we have to do is under the out, I can copy this in case, well, I'm not gonna copy, I'm gonna change it, and let's restore this to version 1, and under the base here I'm gonna call this circular, and we have the shader applied, everything. So let's hit render. And I forgot to make a change to the low res version, so let's cancel this. It's exporting now, but I'm gonna cancel it. Let's go back, and in the low res, I want the low res to match exactly the high res, so we know that it changed. If there is a mismatch in the proxy, it will be really hard to debug the problem and track it down, unless you switch all the proxies to high res and view them in the viewport, which will be super expensive. Okay, so here, this guy, let's delete this. Okay, cool. Let's go back and let's hit render, and it's gonna go through the steps as usual. I'm gonna change this version. I don't need this one anymore, and all we have to do now is type circular here, and it should work. Let's see why. Let's see what's happening. Trying to find if there is an issue. Oh, sorry, yes. So version, it's set to version 4. I need to change that to version 1. And for some reason, it's reading the first one. And let's take a look. Let's try and find why this is happening. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the high-res version to the high-res version and see if it's still, if it will read the original mesh. Yeah, so the original mesh is correct, but the proxy is not. So this is the new mesh that we've created, and let's change it back to the low res, and it looks like there is an issue with the low res version. So let's go back to the scene and see where the low res is being exported. It's being exported here. Let's take a look. This guy. Yeah, I don't see why it would still be exporting that. Okay, you know what? Let's try and make version 2 and see, maybe that will fix the problem, but I can't think of why this would be the case. We can check the path as well. So it's going here, correct. And let's hit render. We can also create a new Arnold procedural just to be 100% certain. And let's change this to version 2. Yeah, there was some issue with export. So now everything is cool, and all we have to do is I'm going to delete these guys. Or how can we make this easy? Well, we can name this XXX, make sure not to export them. And if we plug that in here, they will inherit. It will inherit the transformation. So let me delete. Let me remove all the transformation that we have here, except the scale, of course. And it's all coming from these nodes. No, I don't like this idea. So let's do it again. Let's delete these guys. This is our new wall. Let's move it here. Let's actually scale it a bit. I think I want a little bit more gap. And let's copy this. Let's add a null and rotate this. And let's make one more, and let's rotate it. I think it's too big, but I'm not going to spend too much time. I think I wanted to illustrate the idea of having a new variant, and I think you guys got the idea from that. And this is all tweaks that I'm not going to waste time going through. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for this part. In the next video, we're going to assign the texture. Also going to improve this a little bit. I don't want a huge gap here, so I'll go back and scale all of these guys. Actually going to delete them now. And we'll place the geometry correctly and hopefully finish the scene. So I've made the changes to this guy, and I simply didn't scale it up as much as before, as the same value, and then I just rotated these guys to create the circle. And what else have I done? And then I scaled these guys down. Actually, let me do it live so you guys believe me. I scaled these guys down. They were about this size. I scaled them down, and then I made a copy like this and selected these guys and then rotated them just to add some extra geometry in there, something like that. And then let's maybe move them. I think that's that's better. And just to add some geometry, I don't have a clear idea about that. And then let's move this guy up. I think I moved it up. Yeah, I moved this guy up a little bit just to add some padding. And then what else have I done? I think these guys are too much. They're abstracting too much, so I'm going to remove them for now. And I want to elevate everything. So I want these guys to go up a bit. So I'm going to select them all, hit the T key, and move them up. Something like that. And let's take a look at the ground. I'm going to delete this. Okay, so the ground is cool. Yeah, I really like the elevation of this new environment, but I'm a little bit worried that we're seeing too much of the background. So I'm gonna do something stupid. I'm gonna copy this. I'm gonna create a null and rotate this 180 degree. Okay, and then scale it up. And I'm gonna move this guy up. So we have something surrounding the environment just to cover the horizon line. See now, we're covering it with where is it? That guy. So in case we see behind, we have something, and it will be coming out of the ocean as well. Okay, so what else? We're gonna create a shader. And the shader is actually really simple, so I'm not gonna, it's everything we've seen before. It's actually much simpler than the one we've created, and I'm gonna copy and paste it. Shader with texture for all. Let's call it for all. Let's dive inside, and this is the shader. And let me show the texture. Actually, I have it open somewhere. So this is the texture. It's a tileable texture that we're going to assign to everything. Everything that is not shaded, which is pretty much everything. So let's go through and find that. Not sure if we're using these guys, but doesn't matter. So sometimes when you select multiple nodes and browse, it doesn't apply it to all of them. So you have to be careful with that. And these guys will get it. These guys will get it. Big cliff base. These guys won't. I don't think we're using that. These guys will. No. The ground will get it. The sharp cliff will get it. The sharp cliff base, it's the same. This guy has a texture. This guy doesn't. Okay, what else do we have? And then let's make a simple ocean shader. I'm actually going to copy it from the existing scene, and I will show it the shader. It's very complex. It has a little bit of diffuse, a little bit of subsurface, and reflection, and that's it. Let's go to the ocean and assign that. And we haven't rendered this at all, so we'll include that now. And let's go back here. And the selection, I think we have some, we have some new side stairs. And then sharp cliff, I think that one, this is the new one for the exterior. Probably we need better naming so we can attract these guys. And I think that's pretty much it. We don't need those. I think we need that. And I'm not going to include this. This is the instancing No, it's not that. So we'll tweak them in the viewport, in the render, once we see which one we don't need and which one we do. And let's change it to Arnold 2 and make sure the settings are low res. Okay, let's hit render. It's gonna take a little bit longer to export that. Probably I'll have to move the camera as well. Cool, it looks like we have the texture applied, and this looks much nicer now. And this is rendering with texture and bump and everything, and the new shader has bump as well. Obviously you can see the difference once you put in the time to shade the assets correctly. It's not gonna look as good as a generic shader applied. And you can see the overall lighting has gotten much darker, and the reason for that is because we have less bounce now in the environment, and the ground is not there. The ocean we didn't include. And maybe, yeah, these guys will need to be worked on a little bit more. But I think it's fine. I think we have a lot of interesting visual now. I'm going to include the ground, so, the ocean, and hit render again. There's a lot of cool details there. And then what else I'm going to do? I'm going to render different cameras and stamp the image and show you guys what we've accomplished so far. And I want to wait for this to show up first in case I needed to do some tweaks for the ocean shader. I want to show you that. I don't think I will. I think as long as it doesn't look off or anything, I think we'll leave it at that. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna pause, make few renders, and come back, and we'll continue in the next video. It's rendering, so it's looking really cool. This is again using just 3 samples. So now I've done the renders, and I have them here. So this is the when we start, and then I believe these are the latest one. And I haven't changed anything other than the sampling, and this is what I've got, and I think each took about 5 to 10 minutes, depend on how much details we have close to the camera. And look at how much details we have in these in the shaded element with the bump mapping and everything. I think it's working pretty well, and it's holding up very nicely for the close-up as well. You can see there's a lot of cool details. You can see here, even on a small scale, you can still feel all the details of the texture. There's definitely a lot of information, and then that with the bump, I think it's working really nicely. So this is one render, and then I started just moving the camera and taking more pictures, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it. And then I ended up scaling this object because I thought it's very small, so I scaled it up 2 times and moved it a little bit. You can see the tweaks that we did were based on that light rig, and because everything is occluded now, it's this object is not being hit by any direct light except just a little bit from the sky, but primarily it's in shade, so it's darker, and we have to tweak the values a little bit more. And overall, I think the skylight is a little bit dark because once we enclose the space, it's not lighting all these guys, and I'd like to see a little bit more information here overall. And I think boosting the environment light will definitely help with that. Also, it will increase the indirect illumination, which will bring in more lights in there. And this is a close-up on the rock, which I think because of the scale is not working as well as before with the uh, with the triplanar. So we may have to tweak the shader based on this scale. And let's see what else. And then I changed the lighting. I've hid the sun and the sky, and then added a point light behind this on this wall, and then another point light close to the camera. You can see we're getting all these cool details, and this is not the shade. This is just the temp texture that we applied. You can see we're getting a lot of cool details. This is just a spotlight shining from top to bottom. And I wanted to talk about the LUT workflow again. And let's go to an interesting image. This one, for example. You can see how much contrast we're getting. Even on the blown out area, we're still seeing a lot of information. Now let me turn off the LUT. I don't think I can view them without. Yeah, so the this is without the LUT. Let's see. No, I think it's still on. Let's take a look. Yeah, so this is the raw image, and it's in linear, so it's really it's hard to see. We need a sRGB space, and unfortunately I can't apply that now. But you can see the details, how much they're. I mean, we can't use this. There's nothing useful that can come out of this render. And yes, you can still get some kind of interesting information, but the fall-offs of these lights, for example, will look nowhere near the one with the ACES workflow. And you can see now, look, this is day and night. See how bad this fall off is, and look at this. It's much nicer, and it's much more realistic, and this is the way to go. So I think we're done for this week. I mean, this is the final environment. The next thing would be to go to design something a bit more interesting, probably, and have some actual environment that is functional. And then it would be nice to go over and shade these guys. I've done the shading for this, but we didn't do it in this workshop, so I didn't want to include that. I also did a little bit of shading on these, but again, I wanted to use the same texture. I have a scene for this, so maybe in week 8 we'll go back and do some more shading if you guys wanted to, and then create some more elaborate lighting and hopefully add some atmospheric effects. And I think that's pretty much it for this week, unless I'm forgetting something. Well, if I forget something, I'll make another video. In this video, I wanted to show some more images of things I've done, and different layouts and ideas of what can be done for this project. So I'm gonna go over some images, still images. This is the same wall that we've created and shaded. The new shader that we've made is much better than this one. The only thing is I have two lights, one from each side that has with different colors and use that to do the render, and that's pretty much it. This is the first version that I've done, and I think the new version that we've created together is much more interesting than this. And then this is the first rock. I still prefer this a little bit, but I think the new one we've made has a lot of interesting characteristics as well. I think the main difference in the new one is it's a little bit too dark in the cracks and cavities, and then I prefer these lines straight, and we've distorted them. I think that's pretty much the only difference. And this is some high-res render of the previous version. And again, it's all procedural. And I don't think I added any displacement to this. Yeah, I don't think I've added any displacement. This is a much older version, and this one has a lot of displacement. And I can't remember which texture I used, but basically this is the same idea of what we've applied. Just the texture is repeated a lot more, and used to push the geometry a lot further. And from far away, it looks really cool. It has a lot of interesting details, but once you start to zoom in, you're gonna see it breaks up a little bit. So this kind of details is the one I was talking about mentioning that we need to add using actual geometry. If we needed to add rocks between the cavities, I think that would be really cool to give more scale to the scene. And this is rendered using a different LUT than the ASUS workflow. This is using a Sony LUT, which is very similar to the ASUS one, but has a little bit more warm colors in the white and the dark shadows. It's a little bit warmer overall. Okay, let's take a look. And this is the wall with bricks. I've added the this logo inside, and I used a different shader as well. We'll talk about this in week 8. I'd like to show this separation, and let me make a note of this. I wanted to show how we can drive the shader with, it's a single object, but I have masks too that I use to blend in between different shaders. And the texture is the same one that I used for the big wall. It's just repeated a lot more, and I think I'm mixing it with something else. I can't remember. And then this is very similar. It's just a point light, and this is the wall that we've created, and then they are intersecting. The two are intersecting. You can see the split line is not high up, and I duplicated it twice, scaled it outward, and this is the same ground with a texture applied and then a point light. And see this fall off here? There's no way you can get this type, this fall off with any compositing tricks. There is no way you can get this without having to use the LUT and do the render in this space. And this is where the VFX is making the big difference, is because they have this by default. This is the same scene with the same light rig that we've used, just a different texture on the ground. Again, I don't remember which one. It could be an actual map, an actual texture, and this is the same texture that we've used, and you can see the normals here are being used to drive this to add a little bit of moss to the geometry. And I've rendered a turntable of this. This is done using a real texture for the texturing, but this is the sharp cliff, inverted and shaded. You can see variation between the blocks as well. Okay, let's continue. This is the same without any textures. This is the same thing with the different geometry. Cool. I think that's it for the references. These are some animation to test the assets that I've done. Again, the new shader is a lot better. This is with just the lights moving back and forth. This is with the object rotating. This is with the lights turning. Cool. And this video here is showing the environment rendering, and there's an atmosphere. Pardon me. There's an atmosphere effect which we're going to talk about in next week. Let me show. This is just showing the atmosphere in action, and look at the nice fall-offs here. And this is all. There is no compositing, nothing, and this is real-time rendering as well, including the fog. And this is just the fog with the environment. So we'll take a look a lot more. We'll talk about that a lot more next week. And this is a render with one of the cameras I showed in the environment with the fog and everything. And again, no compositing. This is raw renders. And this is another raw render as well. This is a longer version with a better atmosphere. You can see now there's less noise. You can see the God rays. Cool. And this is the final camera. And you can see the texture is the same here. Pardon me. The texture is the same. I think the HDR is different, and that's what's making a difference in this environment. You can see it's much brighter, and we can keep tweaking that as well. Yeah, the environment is definitely much brighter, and there is a lot more sun hitting the geometry. This is a preview. Pardon me. Excuse me, guys. This is a preview of another layout that I've done where we have that circular wall surrounding the main pillar, and then the sharp cliff outside. So just an idea that you guys may get inspired from. And then this is looking at the scene from the bottom. You can see we're getting all this skylight. This is the camera inversed, and we're getting all these cool skylight coming from the top. Cool. So there's that. And again, this is running real time, and you can see it's rendering super fast. And this is a preview of one of the textures. It's a procedural texture. There is no tiling. You can see the split here, and the lights are rotating. This is just for the ground element to test the texture with. And this is what I use to for myself to preview the textures and tweak them. So I used something like that to test it quickly. And this is a turntable this is a render with just the light rotating. And I rendered a couple of frames, and these are the different AVs. Okay, let's take a look. This is another layout with just one wall. Pardon me. You can see it's the same here and inversed. So these details, it's flipped. So we're seeing the other side of the wall, which we haven't explored yet. But we can add more variation as well. By just flipping the asset and exporting it, it shows a different side. And this is again the light turning, and we can see we're getting a lot of cool indirect illumination coming from, let me show you. Yeah, there's this part here. Let me open this with an image sequence player. I wanted to show specific image. So this guy, come on. See here, as the light comes in, the bounce is starting to show to lit the scene, and it's very realistic. And the bounce is also very realistic because of the LUT. And this will look really bad if you have if we're not using the LUT. It's really hard to get that nice fall offs. You can see here there's a lot of illumination. Cool. That's one more example. This is a turntable of the light ray rotating, showing the details on this element. It's just one texture. There's not a little bit of variation between the blocks, but I think with the techniques I showed you guys, I'm pretty sure you can make this look a lot more interesting. And let's see, I have two more. This one, this is I've done 100 versions of this guy just to show how procedural the system is. And then I animated certain few of the noise values that drives the input geometry for this, and then everything else is the same. And so I've saved 100 geometries and then load them in and render them using the same shader, and you can see I'm getting all kinds of crazy details, crazy variation with just changing few values. This is that asset that we're using here. The idea was I wanted to create sides where I can put stairs in between, but I didn't end up using it. And this is a turntable for a previous version of the wall. I've used the curvature a lot in this version. You can see there is a lot of variation in the cracks here. It's completely different. And you can use it to drive all kinds of cool effects. You can see we're getting a lot of interesting details in the curvature here. And that adds a lot of complexity to the shader as well. So I wanted to talk about what I'd like you guys to work on for this week. Even though there's a lot we've covered, I think the main part is getting some assets, instancing them to create an environment. You can take walls, create a square, and then put something in the interior, drop some lights, and you have a scene. It doesn't have to be something really complex. And I want you guys to try and use some of the assets that you've made. And if they're not working well, go back and iterate on some of them. Don't think of it as a final product locked. And with the scripts and everything, I wanted to show how in a production people would work. And if you're the layout guys, you wouldn't have a lot of information about the assets and where they came from, and you just run a script like we did, and then it will bring in everything they've created, everything all the other departments have made for you, and it would dump them in a scene. They will be most likely in the proper scale, and you just have to place them correctly, which we haven't done, but that's not a problem. The end result is the same. So you would have a lot of assets, and then you start placing them. And once you have the layout, you hit render. If there is any rendering issue, you make a ticket, and that goes back to that person who made the asset to make the tweaks or the change. And or when you do a layout preview and you show it in dailies, they would give feedback about specific asset. Oh, I want to make this bigger or smaller. Unfortunately, that person who made all the asset is you. So when you see an issue, you are the person who will open that scene file and make the change and make a new version and then update your layout scene where you're using it. And I want you guys to try that workflow. You will also get a lot of notes when you work in production for if you're a LookDev artist to go back and change some settings in the shaders. And I want you guys to make that as well. I want you to try and see the shader in the scene like we did here, and then go back to the original scene and make the change. A lot of other times as well, they would ask the lighter to make a local override. Say you're lighting the scene and you want to make a change permanent in the scene only, and to get the shot done. And that's where the import shader comes in. You can still do those local overrides, and then if you receive a new version, you just have to clear out and get the new version from the shading department. Again, you are the same person doing all of this. And I want you guys to practice with this, to understand how the data flows, how to make iterations on the asset, how to create variants. If you want to go there, you can try exploring using the variant option as well. And then try to make an environment, put some lights, render it. That's pretty much it. Try to have an idea of what you want to achieve. Otherwise, you may spend a lot of time trying to figure out things. If you don't have a clear idea, just take whatever you have, and if they resembles to some of the assets here, try to duplicate that. It's totally fine. What I want to see at the end of the day is some cool images rendered using a light rig, using assets you've made in Houdini, and then utilizing the instancing feature. And I think that's pretty much it. Obviously, if you have time, it would be nice to shade as much as possible in terms of the asset, especially that you have to work on them on individual scenes. You don't have to think, you don't have to have a super crowded scene where everything is jammed and you don't know where things came from and what version. You have everything structured. You have 10 assets, let's say, make one every day, shade one asset every day, and then by the end of the week you'll have 7 assets, which is more than what we've used here. We've shaded 1, 2, and we've made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 assets for this environment. And once you get used to this workflow, you'll be able to make much more than what we've done here. Same thing for the texture. You can start with one you like, and then work on that, and have the scene and work on the procedural texture and see how they look like. I'm pretty sure we can make something a lot more interesting. Even for this, I think there's a lot more that we can do to push the quality of these guys. And again, pick a camera and do some renders. And good luck. Thanks, guys, and see you next week.